Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brooke Wylie, she, her pronouns. I am a Two-Spirit from the Colville tribe in Eastern Washington and a board member for Traction. Before we get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that I'm currently residing on stolen Duwamish territory and would like for all of you to take some time at some point in your day to figure out whose land it is that you're living on. Today, we will be hearing from two speakers. Candi Brings Plenty, who is a queer, Indigenous, non-binary, two-spirit Oglala Lakota Sioux. They are a protector of the sacred and activist for Indigenous justice. Their red lipstick is their war paint as they take their place on the front lines as a two-spirit warrior queen. They continue to educate and advocate throughout Turtle Island, sharing their experience as a frontline two-spirit water protector at Standing Rock and as a land defender of the Black Hills. They are a fierce murder and missing Indigenous women's advocate, elevates traditional methods of trauma healing, and empowers two-spirit visibility on all platforms of their work. We will also be joined by Stephanie Byers, Representative-elect for the Kansas House, District 86, and is the recipient of the GLSEN-Kansas State Educator of the Year and the GLSEN National Educator of the Year 2018, and recently retired after 29 years of teaching for Wichita Public Schools. For 28 years, she was the award-winning Director of Bands and Orchestras and Fine Arts Department Chair at Wichita North High School. Stephanie is an Oklahoman by birth, a member of the Chickasaw Nation, and has called Wichita home for the last 3 decades. She and her wife, Lori, own and operate a company that assists corporations, community groups, and schools with understanding of working with diverse communities. Since coming out publicly as a transgender woman, she has advocated about issues impacting the LGBTQ community. She has spoken at rallies on the steps of the Kansas State Capitol and given presentations to several local community organizations, as well as public school faculties and student bodies. Stephanie served as the communications director for Wichita Pride, the local organization that hosts Wichita's local LGBTQ Pride events, and has volunteered for a number of other local Wichita nonprofits. So, Candi, do you want to take it away?
Hematakiapi. Lampe tukile, iu hachante, washte napichuziapi. Imachiapi chante makilawi. Imachiapi chante makilawi, wakiantuampi iyo yampawi. My name is Candi Brings Plenty, and I am an Oglala Lakota Sioux tribal enrolled member. I am identifying myself as a queer Indigenous, two-spirit, non-binary, two-spirit warrior queen. I currently am here on the Oregon coast. I have been taking some time to really work on what my healing looks like for me. And as you can see, this is my first public appearance without my oxygen. I survived COVID. I went through a very severe worst case scenario in my situation as a single parent. I myself was positive, and my 2 children were positive, and I ended up in the hospital fighting for my life. And even after I got out, I have lung damage, and I've been working on, breathing and continuing to allow myself to feel what that looks like for communities who have been devastated by COVID. So I'm here on the Oregon coast, really taking in that ocean medicine, breathing that fresh air, and looking forward in all honesty, to the next legislative session in South Dakota. There has been numerous anti-trans bills, anti-LGBTQ bills for the last 5 years. And I know it's been longer than that, but those have been really prominent cases that we continued to defeat. And so I definitely am taking my second round this year, stepping up to the South Dakota legislative session. And I'm excited to use continued tactics with tribal sovereignty and tribal support systems from the surrounding 9 tribes of South Dakota. So Wopila Tanka, thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Candi. Stephanie, do you want to do a quick intro?
Chokma. My name is Stephanie Byers, she, her, and hers. I am the representative-elect to the Kansas House of Representatives, District 86. And as said in the bio, I am a member of the Chickasaw Nation. I currently am living in a home that sits on land that once belonged to the Kansas. And we're looking at what's going to happen here in the future in the Kansas House of Representatives in particular. This will be my first time as a legislator. I've spent most of my life as a public school educator. And so we're unsure as to what to expect. We do know that Kansas has a reputation of being an extremely conservative government body. And last year we saw introduction of legislation to prevent trans girls from participating as their known gender in sports. As such, we expect kind of a similar legislation to start again this year, as we already have seen the Women in Sports Acts filed at the national level. We expect the same thing to take place here in Kansas at the state level. And I'll be glad to be the person that walks into the room and says, let's talk about this as a trans woman. We can talk about my perspective on how this comes about. I've already pre-filed legislation. Our session doesn't start until January 11th, but I pre-filed legislation along with a couple other individuals to change Kansas recognition of Columbus Day to that of Indigenous Peoples Day. And we'll see how it all plays out. And I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you so much. And now I know that you both have topics that you would like to discuss. So let's get this conversation started. Candi, we'll start with you.
But I'm really excited, Stephanie, also to be a part of this conversation with you, because I think that is so vital and so important. And that is one of the initiatives that the ACLU stepped up to address, was to support more LGBTQ Two-Spirit elected folks to take position amongst all and any of the political positions locally, county, and statewide. So I'm always excited to see a fellow family member who is sitting in those positions to make those decisions and to be those voices, those vital voices that need to be a part of that conversation. And my role, I am the Indigenous Justice Organizer for the ACLU. You know, the first thing that I did was I always take the intersectionalities of my identity to make sure and visually see if I'm being represented or other Two-Spirit folks like myself are being seen in the work that I'm contributing to. So first of all, you know, I noticed a lot of the work needed to be integrated with tribal governments, and to have voices from the tribal councils to be a part of what this looks like. Because for myself, you know, just the word Two-Spirit also to be said in all of the work that we're doing is humongous. It is a really small advocacy component, but it makes a humongous impact. Because when we say LGBTQ plus, you know, we know there's so many of us amongst that spectrum and that rainbow that is incorporated in that plus sign. But to hear LGBTQ and Two-Spirits, that is the most incorporating component, I feel, especially when you're on the legislative floor and you're hearing them in these bills that are being read, to hear Two-Spirit being spoken even is so empowering. So that was one of the first components I did with advocating for Two Spirits with the ACLU, not only just locally, but nationally, to start using the word LGBTQ and Two Spirits, because, you know, it is an erasure component. And Pride did begin at Stonewall, but us Two Spirit folks have been here since before first contact. And that's a humongous erasure. And so that's my platform with the ACLU and with tribal nations, is that we continue to talk about decolonizing, or we continue to talk about indigenizing components, even across the board, including with legislative policies. That representation has to be there. So first of all, you know, we need to identify and elevate the fact that Two Spirit people have been here since before Pride, you know, before first contact, because it is the component that in our Indigenous infrastructures, Two Spirit people have been and were honored and revered and held very specific cultural and leadership positions. And I feel that the position that I'm doing with my advocacy with the ACLU, especially during the legislative session, is part of that Two Spirit walk of life. Being that conduit, being that bridge to voice what it looks like for our Two Spirit folks, our LGBTQ families who are being impacted by these bills. And, you know, I definitely was excited and surprised when we continue to show up, especially for House Bill 1117. That one was vital. That one was an anti-trans bill that was trying to criminalize physicians and care providers of trans youth. Initially, it was a felony charge. And, you know, after the enormous support we received statewide and with other physicians and healthcare practitioners and with tribal nations, we watched how just the visual and the public support before we actually got to the legislative floor, you know, it dropped down to a misdemeanor, and the age dropped down to 16 and under instead of 18 and under. So, you know, even before we hit the floor and started our testimonials, we did a humongous impact. And so for myself, I feel and I witnessed how even what we've seen this year with the presidential election and how the Indigenous vote definitely pivoted some major states. And even, you know, CNN wasn't ready for us and called us something else when there was the categories for ethnic identities in the percentages of what the voter outcome looked like. You know, so I feel like that is what I've been working towards, especially since being at Standing Rock. I push my narrative in the work that I do with ACLU as evolving the front lines from the ground, being boots on the ground, to testifying at the legislative session. So that is the kind of work that I do and that I'm really excited about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Candi. And Stephanie, you want to give some input on that?
Well, and I think it's wonderful because representation totally matters. Recognition for those who are not a part of that represented group is incredibly important. When we look at people who are marginalized, whether we're talking about ethnicity or we're talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, any of these areas, it's oftentimes hard to if you're a youth, to look and say, what are the possibilities I have in my life? Because I don't see people who are like me at those levels. And I think that seeing people that are out and fighting for them, especially in legislative areas, what a difference that makes, because it opens the door to possibilities. You know that when I go into the Kansas House of Representatives, I will not be the only Native American in that floor. And that this year, Christina Haswood, who is Dine, was also elected to office. Hakawi Victors is also Dine, and was reelected to office. And so the three of us, when you have three, you have a voice. You can make a difference. Sometimes we say that when there's two, there can be a will, but with three, there definitely is a way. And so I have that intersection where we're able to move things forward for the indigenous cultures that are represented here in Kansas, either because this is their geographical area that traditionally they've been from, or they relocated here or moved here along the centuries in time. I also, because of the fact that I'm a trans woman, I'm not the only LGBT person serving in our House of Representatives. In 2018, Kansas elected its first two openly LGBT representatives, and Susan Ruiz and Brendan Woodard, and both of them were reelected this last time. And so the three of us helped to make that caucus, and we work together with a group here in Kansas known as Equality Kansas that pushes for legislation that helps to benefit the LGBT community. Some of the things that we look at go beyond what people might think is just LGBT stuff, because we're looking at bullying and how it takes place in the public school, and the ways that legislation can help curb that bullying, regardless of how it affects and impacts other people. And I think that representation, again, moves us forward. It's things of where people can see that we're not just a voice for one thing or another, but we are a collective voice, and that we have something to say about these issues. And some of them are traditionally overlooked, and it's time for us to move forward. And Kansas has not really had to confront Indigenous Peoples Day, and yet here we are, and we need to make that happen. We need to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Columbus never stepped foot in Kansas, but yet we have so many people from so many different tribes that are here that need that recognition and need to be moving forward.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Stephanie. Candi, what are some of the larger struggles that you've come across being Two-Spirit trying to organize on a national level?
Well, first of all, I know that in a lot of spaces, I would definitely seek out Indigenous community centers if that was just my focus. But for Two-Spirits, it's definitely, I seek out those who have been doing the work across the spectrum in the LGBTQ Two-Spirit communities. And a lot of times, there are Q centers or different type of specific LGBTQ Two-Spirit resource centers. And it's been really eye-opening to see how, some spaces will tell me, oh, we don't have Two-Spirits. And I feel like, there's just that education component that needs to be there. And that's exactly what I ran into when I first started my advocacy work in Portland. When I moved there in 2012, I had thought moving from South Dakota, I was going to move to a community where there was vast amounts of other Two-Spirits doing the advocacy work I was interested in. But, I really didn't see that at all. And I ended up creating what that space looked like and building those networks and partnerships in the community. And I realized if this is what Portland looks like, I'm pretty sure a lot of these other cities that are a lot smaller than Portland need a lot more advocacy. And that is something, that I'm really wanting to look towards doing this year, even if it's just creating a toolkit that can be replicated. But, I feel like it's the work that I'm going to be doing through the Two-Spirit Nation nonprofit that I initiated, that came as a planted seed from the Two-Spirit Nation encampment at Ocheti Shakoni. We continue to do advocacy work, and sorry, like I said, I'm weaning myself from my oxygen, so I still get winded just talking. But I'm just excited, so I'm talking a lot. But yes, that is, an initiative that I'm going to be working with. I also received a small grant from the Transformation Project, and we planned on doing a buffalo kill to bring visibility. We want to make sure that gets seen on a national level, and I invited 4 of our Two-Spirit trans siblings to be a part of that buffalo kill so that we can represent and show that we're going to follow traditional protocol, and we're going to offer the buffalo and the meat to the community for the Meals for Relatives in Rapid City, South Dakota, and to the elders, because we need to continue stepping up and leading by example and showing what it looks like to elevate trans two-spirit siblings and non-binary folks in our sacred circles and in our ceremonies. So, you know, I definitely am the Indigenous Justice Organizer for the ACLU, but I am also the Executive Director for the Two-Spirit Nation. So I do a lot of different types of national advocacy across the board. But one of the biggest things I can share with folks is to just step up and lead by example, because there isn't a lot of direction or directives for national advocates or even community advocates or tribal advocates who are bringing two-spirit visibility. It is just about embracing our identities and showing up and educating our communities on what that looks like.
That is some really powerful work you got going on there. Stephanie, have you come across any particular issues being a Native trans woman organizing in Kansas, of all places?
You know, what I've seen coming up, the issue of transgender kids in particular in sports has been at the forefront of Kansas politics this last session. 3 of the folks that were running for nomination for U.S. Senate from Kansas, it became a campaign issue for the 3 of them, you know, and I found myself commenting in national news about the fact that they've run out of things to differentiate themselves, so now they're picking on trans kids to show that which one can be, you know, more discriminatory than the others. And so we expect there to be a fight on those things as we head into the legislative session. You know, we hope that there's not, but we've seen it happen. We saw bills introduced in the last session. In the short time since I came out as my authentic self, and I came out in 2014, I've spoken on the steps of the state capitol a number of times in regards to bills that had been brought up that would be detrimental to the transgender community. And, you know, so we're seeing this repeated over and over again as a cycle. And I think it's important that we understand that there are those issues there. I think also in Kansas in particular, sometimes it seems that, at least at the legislative area, we've forgotten that we have Indigenous peoples that are here. And so it's bringing that voice back in to showcase that there is a reason to look at these things. My colleague Pankawi Victor sponsored legislation last year for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Act to help bring that to the forefront, that those things happen even in some place like Kansas. And kind of like what Candi was saying, we get out into rural Kansas and people will tell you, oh, we don't have members of the LGBTQ community in this town. And you just want to look at them and add that you know of, because it's so unsafe for them to express who they are that they won't reveal themselves. So you don't know who's in your community and who is not. And yet for me to stand up and be a trans woman in the state legislature is letting everyone know that, yes, we do have trans people in Kansas. Yes, we have trans people who are of Native American descent, because yes, siya Chickasaw. I mean, that's who I am. I am Chickasaw. It's a part of my life. And, you know, getting through those things. And we also realize that there's going to be pathways carved open to allow people to express who they truly are. Because recognition is not limited to one thing or another thing. We realize that people come in such a great variety of identities that needs to be expressed. And we need to be able to have a richness of humanity that allows us to accept everyone, regardless of the identity that they present.
Thank you. I know when I was organizing for Greenpeace here in Washington State, even with all the local Native organizers and those different groups, there were still so many people who didn't realize that there were Natives still in Washington, which was always a shock to me. Stephanie, you live in an area where the Natives were actually removed. Have you noticed that, you know, people just don't get that they're still Natives in Kansas?
I think that you know, the colonial period has had a strong detrimental effect on cultures of the tribes that are in the area. We as much as we've tried to hang on to our cultural roots, oftentimes have not seen the encroachment of colonialization, how it's altered those aspects of us that make us indigenous and make us a part of our tribes. Wichita is fortunate that we do have a strong Native American community here. We have a council of elders that meets on a regular basis, at least before COVID. And so there is a connection there. But at the same time, the last native speaker of the Wichita language, where our city is named after, passed away a couple of years ago. And there are these, how do we rebuild these cultures, I guess I should say, when we start looking at that separation from them for so long, and so it is a matter of relearning who we are, and making that a part of it. We have a number of high schools here in Kansas that still use Native American imagery as for their mascots. And all of them will tell you, well, we honor the Native American. And oftentimes my response is how? What is it that you do? How do we teach people what it actually means? How do we teach people here in Wichita about the Kansa or the Ka and their relationship to the earth that we live in here and how they were removed? Even my own tribe, the Chickasaw, they were the last of the 5 so-called civilized tribes that were a part of the initial removal in the 1830s. And even within our own tribe, people don't know the history. They mix it up with other tribes. And it's easy, especially for people who are non-tribal, to not think about how many separate and different nations make up Native America. And that even though there are cultural overlaps between them, they all have their own identities and they're different, because we tend to want to lump everything into just one kind of amalgamated idea of what a North American Native American looks like. It's a matter of getting that education out there so we can go back and explore those rich cultural heritages and look at where they come from. I think it's not enough to know the name of the town you live in, but because I live in Wichita, so where does the word Wichita come from? Why did it come about? What did it actually mean? Those are the things that we think that are important, and those are the things that we begin to get us back to honoring the peoples that were here before, and making sure that we hold their memories in our hearts so that we know that there was an impact here and that we can continue to make that impact as we move on through our lives and prepare for the 7 generations to follow us.
Thank you for that. Candi, do you see at any point where there could be some crossover between the organizing you do for the ACLU and Two-Spirit Nation with what Stephanie is doing in Kansas?
Absolutely. And I'm really, glad they brought up the prophecy for the 7th generation, because I fully, embrace what that looks like and was taught about the 7th generation prophecy since I was little, since I could remember. And I really do feel like, and I'm witnessing it, just as I talked about how we are evolving the front lines. And in the work that I did this past year with South Dakota and our senators and legislators, I had a couple who, sought me out to just learn and wanted to be educated on what it meant to be Two-Spirit for me, and also just seeing that and witnessing that our legislators themselves are still brand new to this Western colonial process. And, I said I brought folks and organized folks to come testify, to come show up. They even planned their own flash mob a round dance flash mob in the middle of the Capitol. They continued to show themselves and show up and what that looked like. And in this photo here, it was when we were having a rally the morning of House Bill 1117, the anti-trans legislative bill that was criminalizing healthcare providers. In the morning, like I said, I put a call out to the tribal chairman. I informed them that we need to show our community and our state what it looks like to support Two-Spirit folks. And in order for us to require our legislators to support and understand what that means, we need to show them what that looks like. So that was the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe who supported, and the Cheyenne River Youth Collective, Grassroots Youth Collective, who showed up on horseback. And there was more than just the two. It was so amazing. And to show up in such a traditional way and to stand on the front yard of the Capitol and to hold a prayer ceremony, to also incorporate what it looked like to encompass our surrounding communities who showed up, to have trans youth and trans students show up, to see for themselves visually what it looked like to be amongst the whole community, incorporating Two-Spirit folks, was humongous. And so, talking about the seventh generation, that is an Indigenous prophecy. That is talking about how, I often bring up how I'm a product of the boarding school era, because both my parents survived the boarding school, and they both have so many horrendous stories. And, our state in South Dakota is still very, very Republican, very openly homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, and racist. And I did open my closing statement with addressing the senators who were on the Senate committee during that Senate hearing. I stated that their white supremacy was showing because they don't consider tribal nations and tribal enrolled members as constituents. And when I said that, I just felt the whole room. I felt all the eyes of those senators. I said words that were never said before because that was my truth. Their white supremacy was humongous. And I want other Indigenous folks, Indigenous senators and legislators who are putting their livelihood down and expressing their passion to create change. I want them to know and feel that, white supremacy doesn't have a place when you're making decisions for an entire state, when you're making decisions for the next generations. There was definitely the same bill that came about. I remember last legislative session when they weren't allowing trans girls to be on the swim team, or when they weren't allowing them to be in endurance activities or sports. And, we definitely went full force on that and defeated that as well. So I feel like a lot of these legislative bills, they are brought together by a national entity, and then they go through each of the different states. Because I know after House Bill 1117, we've seen it get picked up in several other states immediately after we pursued ours. So I know that there definitely is so much ability to bridge time, effort, and initiatives towards partnering with other Indigenous legislators in other states, because the more we can unify the way the opposition does, the better we have a stance to keep on defeating these bills.
Thank you. And I'm definitely seeing some major crossover here with, when it comes to trans athletes in schools. Looks like both of you are working on some of the similar things. Stephanie, how do you think you could utilize Candi, the ACLU, and Two-Spirit Nation to help things in Kansas?
I think it's really important that, first of all, we need to realize, as Candi was saying, there are outside organizations. These bills that legislatures across the U.S. are going to be looking at in the respective sessions here in 2021, those bills are being drafted and written now. We know they're coming about, and legislators will tell you when they introduce that bill that they had no outside influences on it, but the wording on each of these bills is almost identical when it shows up in these different legislations. It's a coordinated attack, especially on trans youth at this point in time. And when voices stand together, we have strength. We make a difference. We can sit there and say, this is not right. What we looked at started with the last set of legislative sessions here in 2019, and then the little bit of 2020 before so many people shut down because of COVID. We saw these attacks on trans youth in sports begin to take place. And we're going to see even more of it coming about this time around. It seems to be like it is the next big platform to push. And, you know, if it impacts one, it impacts all of us. And it's something that we need to sit down and make that concerted effort, whether it's coming from two-spirit organizations or coming from Equality Kansas, coming through me as a legislator, coming through the ACLU. You know, I had the privilege of speaking at the ACLU Don't Roll Back Our Rights rally in Washington, D.C. On October the 6th of 2019, and the outside during when they were hearing oral arguments on Bostock versus Clayton County. The decision that came down in June of this year that talks about how on the basis of sex does include gender identity, it does include sexual orientation. Here in Kansas, our Human Rights Commission, excuse me, has said that they're going to interpret our Kansas Act Against Discrimination through that lens of what the Supreme Court released in June. We already know that the conservative arm of our government is going to fight against that they think that's that's overstepping bounds, that it should only apply to employment and nothing else. And so there's going to be a battle. It's going to be a fought battle. But, you know, I get the opportunity of championing it, but not championing alone, that we have allies, we have those voices, including the ACLU and including other groups that are willing to step up and speak out.
That's really great, and I'm glad you've been able to do so much work on behalf of trans youth. The organization that you and your wife operate, do you ever see that extending beyond Kansas and going out into other areas?
There are a lot of organizations that are similar to us. I think that we each have our own roles to play. And when we talk about politics, you know, all politics are local. When we get people to know somebody, when they get to meet somebody, it takes the edge off of the othering that can take place. And I think it's important. So for us, with Gender Training, our company, we've had the opportunity to speak to the entire collected school nurses, school psychologists, and school counselors of Wichita Public Schools, which may not seem like a whole lot, but we're talking about a school district that services 50,000 students. And so we were given the opportunity to spend time talking with them about, you know, the different difficulties that especially trans youth face in schools, in when people are having, you know, microaggressions and outright prejudice shown directly at them, and how to approach those things. So I know that there are other organizations that do and other companies that do the same thing that we do in their respective areas, and we overlap and we support. One of the things that Lori and I do is we train other therapists. My wife is a marriage and family therapist, and about 80% of her clientele are trans. We train other therapists on dealing with people who have a gender expansiveness that they may not have experienced before in their lives, and the proper ways to approach it. And simple things like, you know, intake forms, adding something besides male and female on the gender list, you know, giving opportunity for people to express who they are. And because, you know, like we said at the beginning of this, recognition matters. Representation matters and recognition matters. And those are huge issues for validation. When someone sees who they are, it makes a tremendous difference.
Thank you. We're coming down to our last 7 minutes. So, Candi, would you like to give your final thoughts and statements?
You know, I definitely want to continue that vibe on representation matters, and definitely recognition matters. And, you know, that's where we take that step forward, and what I like to say, leading by example. You know, I was seeing the sign in your background about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And here in South Dakota, or I'm in Oregon right now, but in South Dakota, there is the Keystone Pipeline that is currently the standpoint of what our pipeline fight is facing in South Dakota. And one of the humongous factors there too is the man camps. And so I have been on those front lines, both opposing those man camps this summer. And, you know, we did an amazing event, or I was invited to be a part of it because it was led by the Cheyenne River Grassroots Collective. They did a Powhatan pipeline, and I thought that was amazing. It is those innovative intentions to show up and represent. And, we definitely need to encourage our youth and create space for them, and also elevate them in any of the kind of work that they're doing, and to remind them just by being themselves that they too are advocates and activists, just, by showing up and expressing who they are on a daily. Because I just can't convey more, enough that we have to start putting this knowledge and intention in the hands of those who are watching us, who are wanting to do the work but don't know how. So, I definitely respond to my messages on Facebook, on Instagram, and I do my best to encourage other folks to do what they can. And a lot of times I like to say, do what you can with what's in your hands, and one of the things that I did recently, because I've been home on sick leave, recovering from COVID, with our Promise to Protect coalition in South Dakota, they did a really big missing and murdered Indigenous advocacy component this past week. And I informed them, how about we use missing and murdered Indigenous relatives instead of women? Because, there's two-spirit folks, non-binary folks, there's even men who are also missing and murdered due to man camps, due to sex trafficking, due to all of the oppositions that we're fighting against. So, something as simple as that, using your voice, sending messages, emailing, we can all do some component of advocacy, of representing, of acknowledging, and creating that space, because that's what we need right now. I feel like following that 7th generation prophecy, in Lakota culture, it is this pictograph on this huge, beautiful boulder in the Black Hills. And there's these 7 elks. The first one is standing up. You can see its horns. And, each one, it starts to sit down. And by the 6th one, it's curled up and it's really tiny, but the 7th one, it's starting to, or excuse me, the 5th one, it's really small. The 6th one, the head's starting to look up, and the 7th one, it's starting to stand back up. So that's where we're at, and my children, I continue to bring them along just so they can see and watch, and they're starting to create their own voices. So, before I say my doksha, see you next time, I just want to, elevate, inform, and encourage folks to keep representing, keep stepping forward, continue to take up space, because not only is those around us have their privilege because it was built on the shoulders of our ancestors, but also we need to do the work and also empower two-spirit visibility, because we are still facing erasure even within our LGBTQ circles. So Wopila Tonka, thank you.
Thank you again, Candi, and thank you so much for being here. Stephanie, would you like to have your final statements?
In 2018, when I received the GLSEN National Educator of the Year award, at my high school where I was teaching, a nationally recognized hate group showed up to protest my being recognized as a National Educator of the Year. 4 people. There were 4 of them stood on the sidewalk outside of my high school. Inside the high school, there were over 2,000 kids wearing trans flags, rainbow flags, pride, rainbows painted all over our gym, celebrating my receiving this award. And, the contrast is tremendous. And you may not believe that those contrasts take place, but when you show up, when someone puts out a call to action and asks you to come to stand at your state legislatures, come to stand in your city councils, come to stand outside someplace, when people see that there's not just 1 or 2, but there is a mass of people that agree, that support, that stand together, it makes a tremendous difference. Write, call, email, contact your representatives and let them know how you feel. I know that you think that maybe I don't know, you might think that they don't pay any attention, but they do. They listen, they read, they work on what is given to them. And as long as they think that they're in the majority, they'll continue to work that way. We know that silently more people support us than don't. And so we need those people not to be so silent. We need them to be able to stand up and say, yes, I am with you. I believe in you. And that will help get this message across. And together we can make those changes that move us into a better people.
Thank you so much for that. I would like to thank both you, Stephanie, and Candi again for taking time out of your day to be here. And I would like to thank everyone who's taken their time to listen to the wonderful words that you've had to say. So on behalf of Traction, thank you very much. And that's it.